In the beginning. That's how the book of Genesis starts. In the beginning, when there was nothing. In the beginning, God's grace and love poured forth and creation became. In the beginning, God established a garden, a place of such beauty and abundance that the relationship between God and all creation was at one. And God placed two people in that garden that they might become the forebearers of all humanity. God bound them together as one people by the Spirit of God. God gave them offspring and bound them together as family because we know that blood is thicker than water. And as their numbers grew, God bound them together as a nation and a people. He gave them an identity. He gave them the bounty of all of creation. In the beginning, God gave grace upon grace so that creation might thrive in love and grace for all of eternity. But blood is not thicker than water. And the Spirit of God is not enough to calm the human will, and nations fall apart. And so the two in the garden rebelled against God, and then the four committed murder. And then the nation turned its back on God and on one another, and the whole world devolved into a fragmented and death-filled place while God wept. In the beginning, in the beginning is how the gospel according to John begins as well. And John, in beautiful form, rehearses the story I just told you. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word brought all things into being, placed them in the garden, gave them what they needed. And then when all things were broken, that Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And he came to us in a man named Jesus. In the beginning, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And God's effort to restore creation to its beauty and its love and grace was bound up in this one man. This one man who reenacted throughout his whole ministry what God had intended from the beginning. Jesus went to a wedding at Cana. And when the wine ran out, because humans don't know how to throw a proper party, and humans are always concerned about scarcity, Jesus acted and turned water into 900 bottles of wine. Such abundance that no wedding party could ever go through the whole thing. He became the Word, grace upon grace, love upon love, assuring all of us humanity that there is enough and that his love surpasses everything. In the beginning, God, in Christ, the Word made flesh, dwelling among us, looked out at a whole field of people with thousands who had come together, and they were hungry. Hungry, that most sinister of motivations. Hungry, that thing that separates people one from another. I have mine, you go find your own. You pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps so that I can have what I need. But Jesus sat them down, and with a few loaves and a bit of fish, raised it to heaven and fed them all. Jesus found a blind man along the side of the road, and while all of the folks argued about whose fault it was that brought him his blindness, Jesus instead healed him and gave him his sight. And there before all of the people offered to give them the spiritual sight so that they could see that the Word had been made flesh and dwelt among them, full of grace and truth, right there before their eyes. But in each case, those first words of John came true. The light came into the world and people chose darkness. The life came into the world and people chose death. The Word made flesh came and it was rejected. And so that garden that God intended to give us from the beginning was still far off. Jesus was taken before Pilate and the religious officials, and as you heard the story, was crucified. The most heinous form of death. The most humiliating way a person of that age could die. And as he hung there, among the last words that he says is to look down and see two people. Kind of like that garden so long before. Two people, a mother and a disciple. We're told in John's gospel, as you just heard it, that Jesus was crucified on Golgotha, a place of the skull. But we're also told that he's buried nearby because for some odd reason, the Romans crucified in this place near a garden. And so Jesus looks down from the cross in this garden and he sees two people. And knowing that blood is not thicker than water, knowing that blood and family isn't enough to keep people together, knowing that national identity or religious persuasion is not enough to reconcile people one to another, knowing that light will be rejected for darkness every single time, Jesus looks down, and now that everything has been taken away, Peter has fled, Judas has betrayed, and the disciples are off into the night, just like the humanity that has been rejecting God from the beginning. Jesus looks down and he starts over again. He looks down in his dying breath and he says, "Woman," to his mother, "here is your son. Son, here is your mother." For there, in the grip of the cross, there where love is shown to us in a way more powerful than we can imagine, there, the sacrifice of this Jesus, the Word made flesh, dwelling among us, unites two people not by blood, not by nation, not by agreement, not by doctrine or code, but by love itself. And Jesus creates with these two humans in that garden the new creation, the new people, the new nation who will be bound not together by their blood, their family ties, their lineage, but by his sacrifice and his sacrifice alone. When he breathes his last and dies, the soldiers come to break legs. It was a merciful thing to do, actually, because it made the suffocation go faster. But Jesus was already dead, and so to make sure, they plunged a spear into his side. And John takes great pains to tell us that what came out of his side was water and blood. He says, with my own eyes I have seen this. Water and blood came from his side. And what is it that constitutes this new family, this new group of people made by two in that garden? But the baptism of the Spirit and the blood of the Lamb that makes us people. Woman, here is your son. Son, here is your mother, and from this point forward, you shall be what God intended. You shall transcend all of the darkness of this world, all of the division of this world, all of the hatred of this world. Put your sword away, Peter. Do not resist any of you. Jesus looks down, and with the water and blood that he gives us to this day, he says to us this evening still, woman, here is your son. Son, here is your mother. Look to your left and right. Look behind you. Jesus says to you this evening, here are your brothers and sisters by the power of the water and the blood. Here is your family by the power of the blood and the water. Here is what will bring peace to the world and end the senseless violence, bound together by the blood and the water that is my love. It is finished.